Eve Gentry is a modern dance pioneer. She lived through the great days of early modern dance through the 30s, 40s, into the 50s, into the 60s, into the 70s. Her life spanned the early period of modern concert dance to the experimental days of dance improvisation. She was involved with the original Hanya Home Company. She joined the home company in 1936. At the same time, she was a member of the New Dance Group, who were very involved in political dance in New York in the 1930s. And she went on to help start the Dance Notation Bureau. And along with that, she was a member, or one of Joe Pilati's Chosen Seven. Eve Gentry started in her life in a small town in Southern California in San Bernardino. And over the years, she traveled up through California on her quest to get to New York, and she finally ended up there. And at the end, when she passed away in 1994, she would have been very proud to know that she had an obituary in the New York Times. And in the midst of all this great career, she never forgot where she started. And the truth is, before there was Eve Gentry, there was Henrietta. Eve Gentry was born Henrietta Greenhood in that small town of San Bernardino. She came from an immigrant family. Her parents were, her mother was from Congress, Poland, and her father was from Germany. They came as Jewish immigrants to New York and eventually settled in that farming town. She was the youngest of 5 children. As a young girl, she didn't have dance lessons. There wasn't money for that, but she always danced around the house. She loved music, and she was scrawny. She was a small, scrawny girl, and her mother was always worried that she would not fill out. So they thought, well, if we can find a way to give her some physical activity, she will develop. And that's how she found herself in her first dance classes. In those days in Southern California, there were dancers teaching in Los Angeles, but that was a far cry from San Bernardino. Eventually, a dance company sent out feelers beyond LA to see if they could start some small studios, and they did an audition in her town. And she auditioned, and they liked her, but they decided there wasn't enough of a population there to start a studio, so they gave her a scholarship. And her parents didn't want her to go to that big city. Eventually, she talked them into staying with the family there, and so that was her beginning. Now, her dream was always to go to New York. When she was in LA, the film industry was really starting to heat up. She was living with a family that was somehow involved with film, but she felt, I want to be a dancer. So one of her brothers moved to San Francisco, and in her mind, that was, if she could get to San Francisco, she would be closer to New York. So she did end up going to San Francisco, and when she was there, she was able to study with a woman named Anne Munstock, who had studied with Rudolf von Laban in Germany. And that was her introduction to the work. She saw herself as a ballerina. Her brother had said, why don't you go to this studio, this Anne Munstock studio? We know them. You can take classes for free there. She walked in and she was shocked. Drums. And the women had on just these little tops and bottoms. And there was a young man there in a G-string, according to Eve, who turned out to be Welland Lathrop, who helped start the program there in the Bay Area. Anyway, she left. She went home. Her brother said, how did you like it? She said, I didn't like it at all, but there was no other place to take class. So eventually she went back. And the thing is, when she stepped into class, they let her improvise. And she fell in love. And true to Eve's character, she went home and burned her tutu and her toe shoes, and from then on said, I am this new thing called a modern dancer. And she got to study with Michio Ito there, so she was exposed to a lot of different ideas. Graham had toured, Humphrey had toured at that point to the West Coast, and that was when she first saw Mary Wigman and Wigman's U.S. tour in 1931. So finally, more years than she thought, it took about 6 years for her to get out of San Francisco. But she found out there was a woman who needed a driver to drive her car from the West Coast to New York. Her name was Miss Burnett. She was a school teacher. She had a brand new 1936 Chevrolet. And Eve hired on to be the driver. The thing is that Miss Burnett would not allow Eve to drive that brand new Chevy over 40 miles an hour. So it was over a week traveling across country in those days with no hotels. They would find places houses to sleep in along the way. And finally she gets to New York after all of that time in the car. Miss Burnett drops her off at her brother's. She goes up to see her brother, and he says, oh, I'm so glad you're here. Let's go have lunch. Well, a week in the Chevy, she was ready to get out and move around a little bit. And so they walked down a couple of blocks, and her brother said, let's stop at Hanya Holmes' studio on the way. I told her he knew Hanya. He knew that it was a small community of artists in those days. He was not a dancer, but people cross-pollinated. And he had told Hanya that Eve was coming, and so they walk up to the door, and she said, sure, okay, well, I'd like to see the studio. They walk up to the door, they knock, the door opens, and there is Hanya Holmes. And Hanya Holmes says, Henrietta, I'm so glad you came. Clink, that's her brother, told me you were coming. Why don't you come in and audition? We're putting together our first company. And that was her first experience in New York. And she auditioned, and she said, afterward, I don't know exactly what I did. Hanya had her walk, and had her run, and had her do some jumps, and move to the drums for timing, use space. And then she said, now I need to see a piece that you have made. Well, fortunately, Eve had a solo that she'd made without any musical accompaniment. And so she did that. And she doesn't remember how it ended. All she remembered was that Hanya looked at her and said, we will try. One thing Hanya Holmes did is make sure that when she came into a new town, she did a lecture demonstration so that people would begin to understand what this new thing called modern dance was. And I think Eve learned so much from Hanya in that time, and I think it's fair to say that Hanya was her great influence. So with Hanya came all of that tradition of German Expressionism. And she also went with the home company to Bennington. In 1937, she was at Bennington and a soloist in Hanya Holmes' great masterwork, Tenant. At that same time, she was able to meet those other dancers from other companies, people like Jane Dudley and Sophie Maslow out of the Graham Company, the folks out of the Humphrey Weidman Company. And Hanya would say of that time there was a lot of green competition among the choreographers. It was kind of a pressure cooker, Bennington, at that point, throwing all of these strong personalities together. But what happened among the dancers, once they got over Well, Sophie Maslow, till the end, said they called us graham crackers. And Eve said the graham company wouldn't talk to the home company. People congregated under certain trees. But that began to fall away in the Bennington experience. And at Bennington, with Jane and with Sophie, she came to learn really of the new dance group. And that was her initiation into that group. And she became a very active member of the new dance group, serving on the board, choreographing. She taught home technique there. So you have this great tradition of German Expressionism coming into contact with new dance group values, that you must make dances about those things that matter, and you must do it in a way that is understandable and clear, because their goal was to communicate their ideas to the audience. In many ways, this work, Tenant of the Street, is a prime example of both of those influences coming together. The social realism of the new dance group, with the clear line and use of tension, the sculptural qualities, and the emotional qualities of the Expressionists. Tenant of the Street was, I think, Eve's signature solo. And she returned to it again and again in her years of performing. But she had stopped performing. Really, she did some work in the late 60s, but not so much concert work. She ended up choreographing first the Santa Fe Opera and doing things like that, and really turned her focus to her Pilates teaching at that point in her life. She also toured rural areas bringing dance to a lot of the pueblos in New Mexico, which is a whole wonderful story in and of itself. But by the late 80s, when she was doing her Pilates work, a woman named Michelle Larson began to work with her. After a back injury, Michelle went to be rehabilitated with Eve. And Michelle is really the person that carries on Eve's Pilates work to this day. But Michelle said to Eve, "It's a shame that none of your dances survive." And Eve looked at Michelle and she said, "Well, you might be able to do Tenant." And so at that point, she began the preliminary process of trying to reclaim the work. She hadn't done it for a long time. A man named Joseph Weber, who was a composer, was set to recreate the sound score from the original notated score by John Coleman, who had done it back in the 30s. And he recorded the piece on piano. At that point in time, Eve went into the studio with Michelle to see if she could begin to sketch it out again. And what happened in that process is that Eve realized that she could not reconcile what she remembered of the dance with the piano score. And I give great credit to Joseph Weber, because he did something very brilliant at that point. He said, "Why don't you set it to a different sound?" And he went out, he was going up to San Francisco. He set his recorder up on the corner of Market at 3 in the morning and recorded street sound. And that's what she set the piece to. And I really believe that in some ways it allowed the work to become timeless. The choreography itself was so. And the sound gave it that space to continue. So Michelle had sketched out the work with Eve, and then it had been set aside for a while. In 1993, the new dance group was gathering forces to have a retrospective gala of all of those great works that had not been seen for many, many years. And they asked Eve if she could send Tenant of the Street to that concert. And that's when I had the great pleasure, some pain, but the great pleasure of helping to reconstruct this work. And Michelle Larson had showed me what she had sketched out. And the first rehearsal that I had with Eve, I remember very clearly. Her walking into the studio and saying, well, we'll see how it looks. If I don't like what you've got, we won't send it. That was almost the death of a dance at that moment. But fortunately, she said, we will try. And we began the process of remaking the work. Eve was a stickler. Every little finger, every line, the impulse for movement was so clear, and she demanded it be that clear. And by the time I was able to work with Eve, she was in her 80s. She did lie a little about her age, but and so we spent time in the studio, and then a lot of our work together was at her home. And she showed me drawings by Ketta Kollwitz that she said she always looked at Kollwitz's work when she began to choreograph. And in those expressive woodcuts, I saw such inspiration that Eve drew on in the images that she had. I remember sitting across the table from Eve, and she reached her hand out to me and she said, you must feel the space around you, and you must be affected by that space. This was a whole new way of approaching that very tactile and larger, cosmic in the sense of the effect of the world around the individual. And in that moment, I came to realize that bodies move differently at different points in time. And this work from the 1930s was going to make demands on me and new ways of understanding how to move that really did reach back to those earlier ideas of German Expressionism that came from Eve, back to Hanya, back to Mary Wigman, in that great tradition that somehow we've lost, and that grow increasingly to me more valuable. Because you see, what they were choreographing were the pressures of the world and the individual's response to that larger world around them. And Eve's great concern, as was the concern of the new dance group, was the human condition. And they had a sense that dance could actually say something. And they were optimists in that they felt that they could affect some change, or at least make people feel something that could talk to their world. And when I first stepped into rehearsal with Eve, she told me 2 stories. And the first story was when she was a young girl, probably around 5, and she was traveling with her father from San Bernardino to Los Angeles. They are much closer to each other now than they were then. And it was a long train trip, and she sat looking out the window of the train. And she looked down, and she saw a woman, and the woman was leaning down into a big barrel. And she asked her father, what is she doing? And her father said, oh, she's hungry. And so that went in. And then, 20-some years later, she finally gets to New York. And she didn't have much money. She did some posing for Noguchi, actually, for 75 cents an hour in her early days there. She didn't even have a coat, though. And, but she was young and she was beautiful. And she opened a door. She walked out into a square. She was at Astor Place. She walked out into a square, and there was a homeless woman sitting across, quite a distance from her. And she walked through the store, and the woman saw her. And she followed Eve with her eyes as Eve walked. And she felt so much animosity from the woman at that point. And surrounded as she was in the 30s, it was not the height of the Great Depression, but there was still a great deal of need, and there were people on the street. Somehow those two experiences came together in this piece. Tenant is not the kind of dance that you can be thinking about something else when you're in the middle of it. If you're not fully invested, it's not the dance. There is no movement in this piece that doesn't have some meaning. Now, that doesn't mean that each person will approach it in the same way. What it means is that the dancer has to dig in so deeply that they bring a particular level of honesty to each moment they're on the stage. And I see dancers changed by doing this work. It's just a passage. It really is just a passage. And in the middle, the way she crafted it, something happened that explains everything that comes before and everything that comes after. But she makes the audience look. She makes us look when we want to turn away. And there's a great deal of dignity in the core of this character that I think says a lot about Eve and about her comrades and how they saw the world and the human being.
I would say Marianne taught this very meticulously and really taught it in layers. She laid out a map and she kept adding layers. The first layer was definitely a spatial map. These are the pathways. This is the journey this person goes on. And then she brought us images of Eve and said, and here are the drawings that inspired it. Here's an image of Eve. Here are some stories about Eve. So we got that layer. Then I would say the next layer started to get into a little bit more of the technique. This is your relationship to space. You really have to look at the audience. You're not just a kind of a glazed general singer. You're being very precise. And then we got into what are your intentions. And Marianne had such specific intentions for every moment of that dance. And there was that moment of finding which images of Marianne's or even Eve's resonate for me, and where do I have to find my own, until I really had a script. I would say a totally nonlinear, specific, theatrical subtext that had room to also change every night. So it kind of set up general conditions, but I tried every night to be surprised by where those conditions would take me. So it was alive. And then the next layer was watching Marianne do it. Didn't see that till the end. And that was also a light bulb, because when she came out, I felt that we had, in a way, had interpreted the movement as almost a sense of sadness or pity, perhaps, or I was projecting my own pity onto the character. And when I saw Marianne do it, I said, no, this woman is fierce. And in that moment, I recognized the character in a much more real way than I had before, in its fierceness. And I think I've told you the story before, that, you know, that first glance, which is what Eve Gentry had a homeless woman do to her. I came out of the bus tunnel in my neighborhood, and there were two sisters who were homeless, and they gave me that glance when I came out of the bus tunnel. Like, oh yeah, you think you're great. Yeah, we see you. I thought, this is fantastic. This is totally the character. It's totally the world. And then finally, Marianne had me do the solo with her. And that was the moment where I thought, what does it feel like to be inside Marianne's body? Rather than look at Marianne, to try to really kinetically empathize with Marianne. One of the things that I think I really will take away from doing this solo is it reminded me of other elements of my technique that I've really practiced and that I really value. And it reminded me that even as I age, and other aspects of my technique or virtuosity, like how high I can hold my legs, might start to diminish, or they already are, that there are other aspects of my technique that in some ways I value much more that continue on, and that they're part of a tradition. And I've studied the theory and the ideas of Rudolf Laban, and I've done a lot of dance theater in my career. And doing this work really gave me an opportunity to draw on those techniques. And, you know, Eve Gentry worked with Hanya Holm. Hanya Holm came to America to start the Mary Wigmon School. And Mary Wigmon, from 1913 to 1920, was the main apprentice of Rudolf Laban. In fact, Laban's ideas about effort and using energy and his ideas of space, a lot of them he really worked on with Mary Wigmon. So some of these techniques, one of them has to do with this, how one perceives space. That space is dynamic, it's a substance, it's a partner. In so much of this solo, you're pressing against space, space is pressing against you. In certain moments, space is supporting you, space becomes a wall that you hit against. Space is a partner, it's alive, and it's vibrant. And also, that comes from this idea of what it is to express a state and express your imagination in a real way through your whole body. So your whole body is part of the statement. It's not just your face. And what I was really aware of when I got into the theater is I found out from people, oh, we can't even see your face. So it's your whole body that has to express this statement. And that means that your whole body has to have this really intimate relationship with space in order to do that. So you're shaping space, but you're also shaped by space. And a lot of that also comes from this idea of using bound tension or bound flow, which we practice in Laban movement analysis, that there's a bound tension all the time. So if anything was really challenging with this solo, was finding also the moments where there could be lightness or breath or just little moments of free flow, so the whole thing wasn't just bound tension. One of the ideas of the technique of Mary Wigmon, which I think is so clear in this solo, not only in the body but in the costuming, is this idea of how energy travels through the body. For Wigmon, it travels up the front of the pelvis, it expands through your upper back, and it comes out through your third eye. That first position, even that walk, it's so much about you motivated from the core, from the pelvis. You feel all that expanse that you're moving into in your upper back, and then all that energy comes out through your third eye. It looks, it sees the audience. It's sort of that technique exaggerated and this little haiku of that concept, which I think is really powerful. And I remember going to the costume shop and being asked to put on my costume, And she had me put the white in the front and the black in the back. And I said, I just don't think that's right. I'm not sure that's right. And we had this debate. And I said, well, I don't think it's right because of the technique. I'm pretty positive this is about the back spreading. The energy through the back is really key. You know, there's even a moment where I'm on the floor and you're exposing that part of your back. And she said, okay, well, it'll take me 15 minutes, but I'll check it out. And she came back. She said, you're right. It's the back that's white. Now, that's so different than how we present the front of our bodies. This idea that it's actually the space behind you that is really supporting you really broad. And I think that's profound on all kinds of levels. Maybe that even goes back to the bodies, the embodiment that I felt. What's behind you is as important as what's in front of you, where you've been, where you're coming from. And that's key in the solo too. You're returning to where you came from. That your memories, your past is as much in the present as where you're moving forward to. Time gets really manipulated in that solo. So in a way, it's happening in real time, but it also feels like that moment might have been a split second. You know, that you're getting a glance inside of a person's mind, and it may not have taken that long. But you're really getting a glance inside of a moment on this person's journey. That's how it feels more than this idea that something's getting edited out and here are the highlights of her day. It feels more like, here's a moment totally spread out, detailed, fleshed out. The day that Marianne brought in the drawings of Kathy Kollwitz and said that these had inspired Eve, immediately a huge light bulb went off. Because I have books of Kathy Kollwitz, and at one point when I was kind of touring around Eastern Europe and Germany doing solo work, I made a pilgrimage to Kathy Kollwitz's museum just to look at her drawings. And the costuming, just on a very superficial level, comes completely out of a Kollwitz drawing. The wearing of the scarf on the head. But also just the bodies, the way the bodies are represented, the mass, the weight of them, the bound tension. Often in Kollwitz's drawings, the women are holding fists, and I get the sense that their bodies are braced against the environment, but there's no pity in them at all, in their bodies at all. And I guess in a way, when I see Kollwitz's, it makes me realize that I'm in a similar position in that I have privilege. So I am going in and I'm observing this character. I'm portraying this character, but only because I'm in a position of privilege where I can. So the Kathy Kollwitz's connection really made me aware of what the presence of the body was, but also the time in history. And I feel fortunate that when I was going to that museum, it was also just after the wall had come down. So I was getting to go to Russia when they still hadn't erased all the sculptures or the murals of the Soviet era. So I was seeing this with the arms out in the beginning, and even the fist in the air at the end completely reminded me of images that I'd seen in this social realism or Soviet murals. And this idea of the dignity of the worker and the persistence of the worker and the power of the worker. One of the most challenging parts of doing this role is that it was very hard on my body. Now, Marianne prepared us that it would be hard on us emotionally. And I've never had issue with going into dark places. I welcome it, honestly. I welcome that this was going to make me really feel something, and it was going to surprise me. But at the very end of the dance, every night, my lower right back would go into spasm, sometimes to the point where I wasn't sure if I could move or get out of the position. And I would immediately have to go and reverse that position, and I said I had this whole ritual around it. So that was just interesting, doing a piece that I know my partner said, I'm not sure if it's worth it. He had a hard time watching it because he knew how physically painful it had been for me. But I do feel it was worth it. I feel it was worth it after I read and kept hearing that many, many students wrote about that solo, and they were struck by the dignity of the character, and that they had seen someone who they wouldn't normally notice or see. So it was worth it to me that even though it was physically painful and emotionally challenging, that it kind of took over my life, that perhaps just reminding us, especially that dance was made in the Great Depression. We're now in what some call the Great Recession. That was a chance to remember people that we maybe don't normally notice, and to see that they have dignity and they have power. Hannah Wiley gave me this beautiful image of the sun coming up through the skyscrapers. And I always imagine these mirrored skyscrapers, which I know in a way is like projecting the future, but this idea that we live in this world now where the world just keeps projecting the world, reflecting the world. Where's the substance? Where's the center? So the sun is rising up on this mirrored building. And then as the sound is the garbage compactor closing, I return to the hunch. It always felt like that moment was real. The moment where I unfolded was real, but at the same time, it was really just in my imagination. It was my inner life, but it wasn't really what I physically could do. But it goes once again, you might see someone on the outside and have no idea what that interior landscape is. And I find that really interesting as a dancer. That's one of the things I love about dancing, is that you get to play with this idea of who you are in the social world, and then who you become on the inside, and this idea that inside and outside is very mutable. You know, that they're not static, solid things. So to me, that was the inner life coming through, and then it returned to where I was physically on the outside, capable of. I think another thing I'm going to take from doing this solo is a reminder of who the audience is, and a new respect, I guess, for where they are willing to go with you as a performer. A lot of the students at the University of Washington were asked to write about the performance, and I was surprised that so many of them wrote about Tenant. I was surprised because my assumptions were, one, perhaps they'll miss that there isn't music. My second assumption was this opening is challenging. It's slow, it takes its time. I'm not the youngest performer on the stage. I'm not the most glamorous, beautiful, great chops dancer on the stage. I'm doing something that I really believe in and love. But I don't anticipate that all the audience is going to be with me, and that's okay. So it was really surprising and amazing to discover that so many of them were completely with me and grateful. And I think so much in our culture, there's this idea that dance has to entertain and be fast and show what you can do. And if you don't, you're not being aware of your audience. You're being selfish. So this was an interesting reminder that really, you know, if it has integrity, the audiences are going to go there with you. And that it felt connected to their lives. And I think that's one reason it felt valuable to them. They could read it. They could understand it.